I've been looking forward to this all week. I'm so happy to be here with you and share with you what God has really given me a passion and what I have burning in my heart with you here today. So I call this No God, No Way. That happens to also be the title of the book that's in the back there, and a little bit more about that in a little while. This is my family. I am by far the least adorable one in that picture. Laura's on the left there. She'll be turning 3 at Christmas. John just turned 5 on Halloween, or Reformation Day for us Lutherans. And there's my wife, Naomi, and she's also in the back there waving a little bit. She'll be the one, if you want to get a book, she'll be able to help you with that at the end. They're $23, which is a couple dollars less than what you'll get them for online after you take tax and shipping into account. But I love my family, and I'm certainly blessed to be at her side. She's an amazing person and an amazing mother. So, as I mentioned, I went to UW Oshkosh, and I was in the secular university setting for quite a while, and before that I was at Oshkosh North High School. But before that, I was in a Lutheran grade school where they really instilled in us the truth of God's Word. So it wasn't until after that I got to Oshkosh North High School where I really saw the pushback on that. And whether it was in high school or the university setting, the overall notion was, it's okay to be a Christian, but if you actually believe the Bible from the very beginning, you're really pretty stupid. And I can prove to you that I'm not stupid, though. Just last week, I put together a jigsaw puzzle in just one day. On the box, it said 3 to 4 years. I also, because I'm a dad, I do dad jokes now. My wife actually dated a professional clown before she dated me, and this is how the night's going to go. But I'll tell you, when she finally broke up with him and decided to start going with me, I really knew I had some pretty big shoes to fill. In any event, as I mentioned, the book in the back, and I've really had 3 reactions to this book. The first reaction, which is by far the most prevalent, they say, "Awesome, nice job, thank you so much for defending your faith in this way. We had never heard these types of arguments before." The second way that sometimes people respond is they would say, you're kind of stupid again if you actually believe that what Scripture says is reflected in the world. Everybody seems to think that there's this big battle going on between Christianity and science, and that you have to pick one or the other. When I was in college or high school, I thought, well, I got to choose. Am I going to listen to what my pastor says and believe the Bible, or am I going to believe what apparently the evidence says and believe what science tells us? But folks, those two things are not at odds. Those two things are in harmony. And the fact that you're here means you probably know this already, and a lot of this stuff is probably going to be review for many people. But God's world complements His Word, and they are not at odds with each other. Science complements Scripture, not the other way around. And then the third reaction I sometimes get is, you really shouldn't be trying to defend the Bible with this. You just have to believe. You just have to have faith. And that kind of gets under my skin a little bit because, yes, you do just have to have faith, but it's absolutely ridiculous to think that God would lay out exactly how He created the world, exactly what happened with Noah's flood, and then set all the evidence in opposition to that. That's not a characteristic of our Lord. He is not a deceptive being. And Paul was very clear on this when he wrote about it. He says what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. In other words, you really got to close your eyes, plug your nose, and cover your ears to ignore God's handiwork and the fact that it points directly back at him. One of the reasons he provides us the foundation for science is so that we can better appreciate everything that he did. It all goes hand in hand, folks, and I look forward to exploring that with you here tonight. So, the sad part about this is this battle between science and religion it's emphasized not just in classes, but it's emphasized in social media, it's emphasized in TV documentaries, and this is a research group, Barna Research Group did this study. They asked these 13-year-olds what the biggest barrier they thought there was going to be between them and being a Christian. And they answered in this way. 39%, this was the number one response. Science refutes the Bible. It's a bunch of fairy tales. How sad is that? And they furthermore asked these kids, what's the most negative perception about the church that you have? And pretty much uniformly they said, again, the number one answer, the church seems to reject what science tells us about the world. And again, if the world that we see and a plain understanding of it goes against what the Bible teaches, that should make us a little bit concerned. But again, folks, it doesn't. The science that supposedly goes against the Bible is deception is really what it is. And you're going to see all that deception here today. And again, it's so difficult to be a young person in the world today and not get caught up in all this. I took a screenshot after I Googled, is evolution true? And you can see I wasn't even able to finish the sentence here, and it automatically filled in with this book, Why Evolution is True. So it's like Google saying, look, we know where you're going with this. Obviously, evolution is true. Everybody with a science degree knows it. Check out this book and join the normal world. And I also asked it, how old is the earth? And of course, if you add up the genealogies in Scripture, you get about 6,000 years. There's very few places you could add years to that. And Google says very plainly, I don't even have to press the search button, 4.543 billion years. It's so precise, it's so accurate, as though they just have this all nailed down. I can never get over that. But this is what we're up against, folks. It's known as naturalism, the philosophical belief that everything arises from natural properties and causes, and supernatural or spiritual explanations are excluded or discounted. And this is what's taught, not just at secular universities, secular high schools, secular middle schools, secular elementary schools. They start this Big Bang evolution stuff in elementary school now, and they weave it throughout the curriculum. So by the time you're in 8th grade, you've had it for at least 8 years. It becomes very difficult for these kids to overcome that when not only are they taught it every single day of their educational life, but when you go on social media, when you go on Google, it all points in the same direction. They all have the same bias towards the earth being billions of years old and that we all descended from pond scum. So one of the things that I've done at Martin Luther High School is I created a class around this. Obviously, I went through my own battle with this, ultimately realizing that a straightforward interpretation of the evidence points exactly to the history that's recorded in Genesis. I wanted to share that with as many students as possible. So I created a class I call Comparative Origins. I suppose a more accurate title would probably be All the Reasons Evolution is Wrong. But these are the different chapters that we go over. And this is going to kind of be the way that we go through this program tonight. And what this is it's basically the structure of naturalism. We start with cosmology, which of course means the Big Bang. And then life spontaneously arose from non-life after the earth somehow coalesced. And then the genetic code coded for itself, and then through natural selection, we've got this huge variety of animals that we see in the animal kingdom. Beyond that, we've got the 3 pillars up there. I like to call them pillars of physical evidence. We've got the fossil record. What do those tell us? What does the actual rock record tell us in the geologic record? and radiometric dating, when we can actually measure these things with clocks, what does that tell us and where does that lead? So that's what this is going to be about as we go forward here. So let's just start from the very bottom. We look at cosmology. I'll change the background there. So again, the story of the Big Bang is very different from the story of creation. According to the Big Bang, there was a massive explosion about 14 billion years ago, and from that massive explosion and that big dust cloud, things started to coalesce and stars formed in the middle and planets formed a little further out and so on. So the biblical story says, no, God made stuff about 6,000 years ago. So we've got these two competing timelines, and they really couldn't be much more different, right? So look, if you were looking for a presentation to go to discuss super long, sophisticated equations and really in-depth doctoral level research, you've come to the wrong one. We're just going to look at very straightforward pieces of evidence. And in cosmology, let's just ask the question, do things look billions of years old, or do they look thousands of years old? How many people knew the Earth has a magnetic field? Oh, good. And it's a good thing we have it, because without it, we'd all be dead. The sun gives off a lot of deadly radiation, and our magnetic field deflects it around the Earth for the most part, and we're able to be nice and safe and not get killed. So the thing about Earth's magnetic field, though, is it's getting weaker over time. It's gotten about, I think, 10% weaker just over the last 180 years. So there's no way it can still be here if the Earth really is billions of years old. Not at that rate. And it's not just the Earth. I could talk about literally every single planet in our solar system with this, which I do in astronomy class at school. But when we look at the planet Saturn, it has rings. I think just about everybody knew that. Now, little thought experiment for you. Imagine your dresser at home is nice and clean, nothing on top of it, and it's just nice and smooth. You just cleaned it off. Then imagine you let it alone and you don't touch it in any way for a full year. What's the top of that dresser going to be like? It's going to be very, very dusty. And you know what? The rings of Saturn are really very similar to that. There are a lot of contaminants out in space. We've got space dust, we've got micrometeorites, all sorts of things moving around out there that should make the rings of Saturn, which are primarily made up of ice and some rock, that should make them very, very contaminated. But they're not. They're pristine, absolutely clean, almost as though they haven't been out there for 250 million years, left over from Saturn's supposed formation. Saturn looks young. And it's not just regular planets from the solar system. It's dwarf planets too. I love talking about Pluto. You know, when I started teaching astronomy, we knew very little about Pluto. And then in 2015, of course, New Horizons mission got there, and we got all this brand new information about Pluto. And everybody thought Pluto was going to be this cold, dead, uninteresting world. Because if it's this tiny little planet out there, and I do still think it should be a planet. Anybody with me on that? So if it's just this tiny little world out there, it should have long since ceased any internal heat, any tidal activity, or any that it would have absorbed from the sun, or any other internal heat that it would have had should have long since dissipated. Well, guess what? That's exactly what we didn't find. Completely opposite what the secular scientific community thought they'd see. We see active cryovolcanoes. We see that it snows on Pluto. It has an atmosphere that should not be there if it's really that old, because it's being stripped away by the solar wind. Folks, Pluto looks young. It looks thousands of years old. It has characteristics it sure can't have if it's really billions of years old. And again, this is just a quick overview. I'm compressing my class, which each of these sections I spend 3 full hours talking about, and I'm compressing that all into 1 hour. So this is kind of a greatest hits. And so, so you could also talk about the moons here too. This is Triton, a moon of Neptune. It also has cryovolcanoes and cryogeysers. But they can't still be erupting if Triton is really left over from Neptune's formation and is billions of years old. Would have long since run out of material to shoot up into the atmosphere and out into space. It can't happen in a billions of years old moon. So when we look at cosmology, and I could go so much further with this. There's so much more that I'd like to share with you about how galaxies are spinning and why everybody thinks there's this stuff called dark matter out there. And I'd be happy to talk with you about that afterwards if you want. I'll stick around as long as you guys are interested to stick around. I love talking about this stuff. But when you look in space, whether it's the Earth, whether it's the sun, whether it's stars, whether it's galaxies, whether it's other planets, whether it's their moons, everything has characteristics that they can't have if they're really billions of years old. And, I could just end this talk right now then, because if you don't have billions or hundreds of millions of years to work with, this whole philosophy collapses on itself. Because if the world is really just thousands of years old, you have no plausible amount of time for any origin of life from non-life scenario to take place. There's not enough time for the genetic code to code for itself or natural selection to give you all the different animals we see in the world today. It's impossible. So the timeline is really kind of the linchpin here. But I've still got about an hour to fill. So we're going to keep on going. And what I tell my students is this. You know what? Let's give naturalism the absolute best chance to have a couple legs to stand on here. So let's just pretend for a little while that the universe is billions of years old. If that's the case, is it possible for life to spring from non-life? And that's what we're going to take a look at right now. So when we talk about the origin of life, it certainly seems like life could just spontaneously arise out of nowhere, right? So in the summertime, it doesn't seem to matter how many times I spray Roundup in between the slabs on my driveway. Weeds just pop up, seemingly out of nowhere, and in between the sidewalk cracks, right? Yeah, you can spray them, and they're gone for about 3 weeks, and then they come right back. It sure seems like life can just appear. But folks, it can't. That's one of the main laws of science, is that life begets life. Those weeds got there because there were seeds going through the air that we can't see because they're too small, and they embedded themselves in those unfortunate cracks. But, when we talk about life coming from non-life, oftentimes we hear this term that life began in this primordial soup. How many people have heard that term before? Oh, good. So, primordial soup would inevitably have to have water in it. Water is required for every living thing. So they kind of imagine this primordial soup at just the right temperatures with just the right molecules in there, and maybe you hit it with lightning a couple of times and you have some simple cell sort of come out of that, and then life, goes from there, and ultimately you get human beings after 4.5 billion years. So, as unreasonable as that sounds anyway, it's not possible because, like I said, you're going to have water there. Every living thing needs water, but water has a special property known as hydrolysis. And so what that means is, a lot of times the scientific community imagines these molecules coming together and linking up and making these amino acids that one day would bring about the first living cell. Well, hydrolysis is a property of water that even if that would start, it messes everything up. So as long as there's water in your primordial soup, there's no way you're getting life out of that. But if we're thinking of life coming from non-life, as just getting the right molecules in the right place at the right time, if that's how we're thinking about this, we're really underestimating what life really is. So, we've all got probably our phones on us right now. Imagine you take your phone and you rip the back off of it. You're going to look in there, you're going to see a lot of sophisticated hardware. But the hardware is absolutely nothing compared to the sophistication on the software running inside your phone. So if you would drop your phone into water and all of the programs, all the software got wiped off of it, what's going to happen when you try and turn on your phone? Nothing. What's going to happen when you try and turn on the flashlight? Nothing. What's going to happen when you get hungry and you want to order a pizza from Domino's? You're not going to be able to, because those things are programmed in there. Without the software, the hardware can't do what it was designed to do. So you still have, if you drop it in the water, you pick it out of the water, the hardware is still there. Everything looks the exact same as it did when it worked. But if the software is not programmed in there, that phone is no more alive than a brick. And you know what? Even the simplest living cell is the exact same. Every simple living cell has innumerable molecular programs running on it that cause it to be alive, reproduce, eat, do everything that a cell needs to do in order to be alive. There are thousands of these programs running inside every single one of your cells right now, and every single one of my cells right now, any one of which, if it stopped working, we would fall over dead this instant. And I'm not sure if this next one's going to work. My guess is it isn't. So it would show you one of the many software programs running inside every single one of your cells. It shows the process of transcription as you go from DNA to protein. And it's an absolute intricate process. It looks like the sort of thing you'd see in a factory. And the stuff that would be in that animation happen at about 10,000 times the speed you would have seen, because that's how fast it needs to happen for you to actually stay alive and continue to live. These programs are 100% sophisticated, way more sophisticated than even the most advanced computer on Earth right now. Again, if we're thinking of life as just having the right things in the right places at the right times, we are really underestimating what life truly is. We're not giving it the credit it deserves. So, a lot of scientists actually realize this. And they realize there's no way all these sophisticated programs can just happen on their own. Every program you see on Earth requires a programmer. But they don't want to go to the God of the Bible. Unfortunately, that's like the one thing they're not going to allow into their hearts and minds and souls. So a lot of times, one thing it's kind of waxed and waned in popularity. At the moment, it's kind of getting more popular again. The idea of panspermia. How many people know about panspermia? Okay. Yeah, so panspermia is the idea that, well, we can't explain how life got here, so we're just going to say that aliens from outer space came and seeded life on Earth, and then they got out of here, and that's how this all got started. And it's like, it's silly, but how sad is it that this is what people cling to in order to deny the fact that they are accountable to a creator? That's the real sad part of all this, because it really is pretty silly, because it doesn't even fix the problem, right? Because if aliens seeded life on Earth, you probably know the question I'm going to ask. Who created the aliens? Right. Well, other aliens created the aliens, obviously. Well, who created those aliens? Well, more aliens created those aliens. But you can't keep pushing the problem back forever, because this Big Bang event happened in the finite past. It doesn't go back to eternity. The universe had a beginning. Even all scientists agree on that today. So again, when we look at the origin of life, it all points to the fact that it can't happen on its own, even if you did have billions of years to work with. Honest, straightforward science done in the present says that it can't happen. So how about genetics and DNA? So you probably recognize the double helix in the background there. So let's talk a little bit about it. So that's a DNA double helix. And DNA is basically your body's instruction manual. It determines how your body looks, and it determines how your body works. And inside your DNA, or inside, your DNA is inside cells inside your body. And there's all different types of cells that each one of us have. Your heart has heart cells, your brain has brain cells, your liver has liver cells, and so on. Now, unfortunately for us, our cells don't last forever. Every 7 years, they say, you're actually a brand new person. Because after that amount of time, every cell in your body has actually died, replicated itself, and been replaced. So every 7 years, you're actually physically a brand new person. It's kind of interesting to think of it that way. But this cell replication process, which keeps us alive, you have to have cells that replicate and copy themselves. Otherwise, you're going to die along with them when they die. This process has some unfortunate consequences. So, what happens if you make a copy of a book page and then you take that copy and you make another copy? And you take that copy and you make another copy. And you take that copy and you make another copy. What's going to happen before too long? It's going to get fuzzy. It's going to get tough to read. It's going to get pretty hard to make out what was originally there. It's not the way it was originally designed. And the same thing happens with our cells. And the same thing happens with our DNA, which is inside our cells. So again, your DNA is the instruction manual that tells your body how to work. Well, if you make all these copies of your DNA and there are mistakes in that copying process, which happens every time a cell divides, your DNA suffers as a result of that. And, this is ultimately why we age, and ultimately it's why we die. This is why as we get older, our skin gets a little bit more wrinkly and crinkly, because your skin cells continually divide, and as that happens and the genetic information gets corrupted, we call these mutations, genetic copy errors in the DNA. These mutations accumulate, and your skin does not work the way it was originally designed. And skin is one thing, but again, this also happens in your vital organs. And it's just a matter of time before things get bad enough that you can no longer survive that. Professor John Sanford, some of you might have heard of him, puts it this way. This is best illustrated by just considering it on a personal level. In your body or in my body, we have about 3 new mutations every time a cell divides. Again, mutations are just genetic copy errors, errors in your DNA when it's copied through this process. So this is sobering because it's the reason we die. And so the reason we get old and all of our systems start to break down is because of this mutational process and the accumulation of bad mutations in our genome. It's why there's an upper lifespan. And it's like, I don't mean to bring everybody down, but it gets worse because these mutations also accumulate in our reproductive organs. So when you decide to have kids, you pass a certain number of the mutations that have accumulated in your reproductive organs onto your kids. It's estimated that this number is about 100. So every generation starts out with 100 more copy errors, 100 more mutations than the generation before. So folks, This flies exactly in the face from what we hear from the scientific community. So what do we hear? We hear that that humanity has been evolving onwards and upwards from our monkey ancestors for the last 5-6 million years, getting better and better and better and better and better. But in reality, when we look at the real science, what does it tell us? Things are getting worse and worse and worse and worse. The human genome is rusting out. It is not getting better. This is a well-known fact, folks. This is not something that you need a doctoral, background to understand. This is common sense. So when we're talking about how things are getting worse and not better, John Sanford likes to use the phrase, things are going down, not up. That's the best way to describe all this. When we're thinking about that, boy, how well does that fit into a biblical worldview? Ever since the fall, things have been in a state of decay. This is exactly what we should expect from the Christian perspective. So again, even if you did have millions of years to work with, it doesn't matter. Things are getting worse and worse and worse every single generation, and if you did have these millions of years, it wouldn't matter because humanity would be extinct by now. So, can you tell I get passionate about this? Having been through the secular system, which I'm glad I went through right now, because if I hadn't, I wouldn't have had to go through that inner turmoil and get all this stuff figured out. I wouldn't have the passion that I have for it if God saw fit to send me to a Christian high school or a Christian university. God always knows what he's doing. So, again, when we're dealing with this stuff, and we look at how, when we look at the real evidence, it all points toward the Bible and not away from it, this should not surprise us in the least. God's world is reflected in his word, not the opposite. So natural selection. Once again, let's give naturalism the absolute best chance to survive here. Let's say that you've got millions of years to work with. Let's say life did somehow come from non-life. Let's say that in terms of genetics, things are actually getting better and not worse. Okay, fine. Let's start there. Let's take a look at natural selection and find out if this is something that can actually give us the variety of creatures that we see in the world today. If you have something that's alive, can it diversify and eventually over time turn into something that's completely different? Let's see. So first off, Darwin's book, Origin of Species by the Means of Natural Selection. So again, the origin of species, where everything came from, where everything got its start, is through this process known as natural selection. And he had his tree of life right there. So again, the idea is we all have this common ancestor down here, and over time it branched off maybe into fish, and over here into reptiles, and over time amphibians, and land animals, and ultimately monkeys and human beings. So I'm a dog person, so I want to use dogs to try and help do this example. My favorite place to go for information on all these topics, especially as I was doing my research, was creation.com, the folks at Creation Ministries International. So I've had the privilege of meeting all the folks at their U.S. office at a creation conference that I went to with my wife in Myrtle Beach 6 or 7 years ago. Fantastic group of people, and if you're familiar with them, you might recognize this example. So who else in here is a dog person? Okay, good. Good number of people. So let's say we've got these two dogs right here. So we've got Mom on the left, we've got Dad on the right, and you can see they've got these little red things inside their tummies. So these are genes, and what genes are is they're a collection of DNA letters that actually make something physical. They give you a certain physical characteristic. Like in this case, we would say these determine the hair length on these dogs. So this would be a gene that codes for short hair. This would be a gene that codes for long hair. So you can see Mom and Dad We'll give them names. We'll say Bingo and Daisy. They each have a gene that code for both of those. So, who remembers their Punnett squares from biology class? Oh, good, a fair number of people. Okay, so you've basically got 4 different ways that these genes could work together to figure out what kind of puppies these 2 parents would have. So these 2 parents fall in love and they decide they want to start a family. Very important decision in the life of 2 dogs. And let's say the first of the puppies gets the short hair gene from mom, the short hair gene from dad, and they have short hair. The other combination, short hair gene from mom, long hair gene from dad, or the other way around. Short hair gene from dad, long hair gene from mom, and those 2 would end up with medium length hair. We would say those traits would be co-dominant in the biological world. Or you could hit the jackpot. You could get the long hair gene from both parents and end up with that adorable fur ball. Now, imagine we've got this family of dogs here, and those 4 grow up and they become adults, and they want to move out of their parents' home. And so they decide to they catch the who caught the Packer game this last weekend? How much fun was that? Oh my goodness! Well, the last second anyway. So these 4, we'll say they decide to move away from their parents' home in the sunny streets of San Jose, California, and go to the frozen tundra of Green Bay, Wisconsin, because they're Packer fans. So how is that going to go for those 4 dogs? Now, I don't like to talk about dogs dying, because I love dogs. So instead of saying that these 3 are going to pass away, I'm just going to say they'd move away, because they're not well adapted to the cold temperatures you're going to get in the wintertime in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Not many people are either. This short-haired dog is not going to do well. He's going to get out of there. Medium hair length dogs, they're not going to do well either. So they're going to go out of there too. But this long hair guy, he's going to be just fine. He's got all this fur, he's well insulated, and it's only a matter of time before he falls in love with another furry dog who's well adapted to that environment. And once again, it's only a matter of time before they make that important decision to start a family. And they do so. Now, what kind of dogs are these 2 parents going to have? Long hair. Because those are the only genes that they have in their genetic code. So, a change has definitely happened in this population of dogs. And in my university biology class, they said, look, Chris, this population of dogs has changed one generation from another. We can see that they change. This is natural selection. And imagine if you have hundreds of millions of years to work with, and all these changes keep building up, maybe at the end of it, you don't even have a dog anymore. Maybe you've got an elephant or something like that. And that's very easy to believe, because it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? But again, we have to be critical thinkers here. It's not whether or not a change is happening. Certainly a change is. These dogs are definitely better adapted to the environment. They have gone through a change. But that's not the kind of change that's going to ultimately turn them into something else. If you want to go from a dog or a cat or anything else into a brand new animal and have brand new features that weren't there anymore, you need genetic information that wasn't originally there. You need a mechanism to create brand new genetic information. What's happened to our genetic information here? We've lost it. It's going away. Again, going down, not up, folks. This is the exact opposite direction than what we would need to see if natural selection really was this magical creative process through which we could get brand new creatures with brand new features. It doesn't work that way in the real world. Natural selection is not a creative force, despite the fact that a lot of people like to talk about it that way. It doesn't create anything. Kind of like the name says, it just selects from what's already there. At best, it rearranges the genetic information, but most often, you lose genetic information in the process, just like this. Yeah, you can have a creature become better adapted to the environment. You're not going to gain genetic information when that happens. You're going to lose it every single time. So what we see is that when we look at Darwin's tree of life, this is not what we find evidence for when we look at science. Not in a real way, anyway. Not when we don't use a ton of imagination. But what we see evidence for is what's up here. And you may have heard this referred to as the creationist orchard. The idea that God created the basic kinds of animals, the animals that were on the ark and exited the ark, and then through natural selection, they kind of diversified over the years to become better adapted to the environments that they occupied. You can kind of think of it like maybe this one was the original bear kind that walked off the ark. And then they transformed into panda bears and grizzly bears and black bears and brown bears. And that's what we find evidence for. Maybe this was the original canine kind. And these canines that came off the ark eventually branched off into coyotes and wolves and foxes and domesticated dogs and dingoes. That's what we see evidence for, not that they turned into something else or have their origination in something completely different. I like this quote by Dr. Gellertner, Yale University. If somebody says something like this while they're working in a secular university, they're not going to last long. You make your feelings known about this topic, everything that makes for academic success goes away. You're not going to get funding, you're not going to get research, you're not going to get grants, you're not going to get respect. But that doesn't prevent people from making their feelings known once they retire. And that's what happens here. So Dr. Gellertner says this, I think it was in 2019, "There's no reason to doubt that Darwin successfully explained the small adjustments by which an organism adapts to local circumstances, changes to fur density or wing style or beak shape. Yet there are many reasons to doubt whether he can answer the hard questions and explain the big picture, not the fine-tuning of existing species, but the emergence of new ones. The origin of species is exactly what Darwin cannot explain." It's like, couldn't have said it better myself. He hits it right on the head there. So natural selection cannot help this process. Every single step on this naturalistic philosophy crumbles as soon as you just look at it through a lens of common sense. Whenever you look at the evidence through a lens of common sense, it doesn't point in that direction. It points in the direction of biblical history, as we've been talking about. So now I'd like to talk about the actual physical evidence. We'll start with the fossil record here. So when we dig up these fossils in the ground, what do they actually tell us? What story do these bones tell us? Now, when we talk about the fossil record, we talk about fossils, what animal jumps to your mind? Dinosaurs, absolutely. So that's what I'm going to talk about here. So what's going on with the dinosaurs? Because oftentimes you'll hear, if you're in a university setting, somebody finds out you're a Christian that believes that the earth is just 6,000 years old, one of the first things they'll tell you is they'll say, well, what about the dinosaurs? As though that's this trump card that you'll never be able to answer. Well, dinosaurs, in the absence of anything else, point exactly in the direction of the Bible, maybe even more strongly than anything that I've mentioned up to this point. So again, let's just look at this from a common sense perspective. And I'd like to look at this in two ways, through historical evidence and through physical evidence. So what does the physical evidence tell us? When you've got a dinosaur bone, what story does it tell when you examine it, when you crack it open and you see what's inside there? Well, what we find, many of you already know this, I'm sure, we find soft tissue, we find blood vessels, we find DNA. Sometimes we even find unfossilized bone. Folks, these things, soft tissue, muscle fibers, ligaments that are still stretchy when you look at them under a microscope, this cannot still be here if the bone is really 65 million years old, like the scientific community tells us. Dinosaurs supposedly went extinct 65 million years ago. And yet we're finding these organic things inside literally every dinosaur bone that we're willing to crack open and examine. But it can't be there if they're really that old. Organic things break down extremely fast over time. They're not going to last 50,000 years in the temperatures the dinosaurs thrived in, much less 65 million. Even if you freeze it, they can't last longer than 1 million years by the way we see them break down over time. And it's from literally every dinosaur that we've examined from these things. The other thing I want to talk about is the historical evidence. So if dinosaurs actually were created on day 6, the same day as humans, I mean, that means we coexisted with them. They would have been on the ark. They would have come off the ark and shared the world with us for at least a while afterwards. But if we evolved from monkeys 6 million years ago, and the dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago, that's a huge amount of time between those two things. So there should be absolutely no evidence when we look at the historical evidence from cultures across the world that humans and dinosaurs have interacted. So let's just see if we have. This is a sculpture about 4,000 years ago in China, and it just so happens to look exactly like the Centrosaurus, which we just so happen to find fossilized in that area. What are the odds? Another sculpture from China, dated to about 4,000 years ago, and just so happens to look exactly like the Protoceratops. Of course, the scientific community says this is just by chance. Because, again, dinosaur bones were not dug up until the 1800s, and this is from 4,000 years ago. And it's not just the ancient Chinese. Really, every single ancient culture that has left behind a good amount of things for us to study about their traditions and their legends and things that they did have examples of creatures just like this. This is a Mayan mural from about 2,000 years ago, and I'm not sure how well you can see, but they're doing some sort of ceremony. They're wearing decapitated animal heads on their heads as hats, kind of a bold fashion statement. Looks like there's some sort of puma right there. That might be a cheetah, maybe an anteater, a big fish head right there. And there's this weird-looking fella. That's kind of interesting. Well, what's that look like? Looks like something you'd see in the Jurassic Park movies, right? But nobody was around 2,000 years ago to tell these Mayan people that what they drew had actually been extinct for 65 million years. Folks, they drew what they saw. Every single animal from that mural is a real animal. And so is this one. So yeah, it was one of those, most likely the raptor-type animals that you see from the Jurassic Park movies. And there's one more that I want to share with you. This is from Carlisle Cathedral in the UK. And, picture's worth 1,000 words, right? You ask any adolescent what this is, and they'll probably not only say it's a dinosaur, they'll probably tell you the exact kind of dinosaur it is, right? This is one of those long-necked sauropod-like dinosaurs. And this is in the UK from just 500 years ago. So, again, when we look at this stuff, it kind of gives us a better understanding and a better appreciation for these creatures and how recently they probably have been around. So one of the things I like about this picture, people from the scientific community would look at it and they would say, well, this is not an accurate description of a sauropod dinosaur, because when they saw it, they knew what was there. They said, there's no way this is accurate. These gigantic dinosaurs with huge tails surely would not have elevated them. Their tails were enormous. They wouldn't waste that energy. So for a long time, you see these creatures in museums dragging their tails. Well, do a little bit more research, a little bit more critical thinking, and they figured out that these dinosaurs had to elevate their tails in order to aid with balance as they were walking. So not only is this a perfect description of a sauropod dinosaur, but it's also got the exact perfect posture that it would have had. And this is, it gets me excited to see this stuff, and I wish I had known about this earlier than when I saw it, because you'd think, wow, this is amazing stuff. And the evidence all is pointing in the same direction, folks. And it's at this point when I always kind of get brought down to earth. Here's a quote from Dr. Scott Todd, Kansas State University. He says this: even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. In other words, even if all the arrows in the world point exactly in the direction of a designer, of a creator, of God, towards the Bible, they're going to ignore it. They're going to close their eyes. They're going to plug their nose. They're going to cover their ears for as long as it takes, because they're not willing to be accountable to their creator. When I was growing up, it was common to hear that science was the search for truth. But it's not, is it? And we all know that now. Science has just become a running hypothesis on how things could have gotten here without a creator. How far? You can't get any further from the truth than that. So that's the fossil record. And the fossil record has a lot to do with the geologic record, because the fossils that we find are in the rocks that make up the geologic record. But when we look at the geologic record, the easiest place to see that record is at the Grand Canyon, where you can see all those individual rock layers one after another. And of course, they have their plaques and their displays. This rock layer was 100 million years old, and 20 million years later, this one was laid down on top of it. And they've got this beautiful story that they tell. So I just want to take a brief look at the geologic record here, primarily through Noah's flood. So when we look at this map, each red dot represents where we find land dinosaurs fossilized. Now, to get the significance of this, you got to know what it takes to create a fossil. You need two things to happen. Number one, you need that creature to be covered extremely fast by both water and sediment. You need the sediment to cover that creature quickly so that scavenging doesn't happen, because if you have scavenging, it's not going to be long before you're left with nothing, including bones. And you need the water because it's the minerals inside the water that deposit themselves on that creature's bones, which ultimately turns them into a fossil. So a fossil is really nothing more than a bone that has become mineralized. So this all has to happen very fast. So basically, you need a flood. So up here again, we see these red dots representing where we find land dinosaurs fossilized. And I just put that up there because, if I put a red dot everywhere we found any land animal fossilized, the entire map would be red. So which answer sounds more reasonable? That there was an individual flood at every single location on Earth, and that's why we find fossils all over the Earth, or that there was one massive watery catastrophe that laid them all down at the same time. I know what makes more sense to me. Now, the other thing with this is just looking at the histories. When we look at cultures across the world, in the same way that they leave behind records of these dinosaur creatures, they also leave behind records of a worldwide flood. There are over 500 legends of worldwide floods from ancient cultures all across the world. And I'll just name a couple of them off for you. Oh, they're not going to come one at a time. They're everywhere. I'll just say that. Even isolated islands like Hawaii and Fiji. Folks, these people did not have phones. They were not texting each other how they believe the world got to look the way that it did. So again, I'll ask the same question. What makes more sense? That all these cultures just happen to have made up the same pretend flood story? Or that they all point back to the same real event in history? When you look at the evidence from the perspective of common sense, it all points in the direction of the Bible, folks, regardless of which of these sections you look at. So let's take a look at radiometric dating. So when we look at radiometric dating here, this is where we're going to find where these billions of years kind of have their origination, because we hear that number so often. Where did it come from? So imagine I told you right now your chairs were radioactive. And imagine you believed me. What would you do? You'd probably get up and get out of here. And for good reason. In order to understand radiation, you really have to understand a little bit about radioactivity and how that all works. So the way radiometric dating works and how this all is connected, imagine you start with a big chunk of something that's radioactive. Now, if it's radioactive, that basically means it's unstable. Over time, it's going to change, or in sciencey terms, we say it's going to decay into something else that will ultimately not be radioactive, that would be stable. So the idea is, if you know the rate at which that decay happens, and you know how much radioactive thing you have here and how much non-radioactive thing you see afterwards, you can look at those two ratios and kind of make an age estimation there. And that's kind of how this works. So it's this process of decay from radioactive to non-radioactive that releases the radiation that we're all kind of afraid of here. And that's where that comes from. It's just a natural byproduct of this radiation process. So it seems like a pretty straightforward thing. You look at the ratio of radioactive element to non-radioactive element, and you compare them. And based on how much of each you see, you can make that age approximation. So how does this turn out with rocks that we actually know the ages of? Well, in 1984, 4 years after the Mount St. Helens eruption, a lava dome was made over that area in Mount St. Helens, and it created a big area where lots of rocks were made. So those samples were taken in 1996, a full 12 years later. So ideally, if you radiometrically date these, you'd get an age of 12 years. So let's see what they actually found when they radiometrically dated these rocks. Yeah. So not only are these numbers inaccurate, they are inconsistent, which is the worst of both worlds in the science world. It would be one thing if they were all equally off in one direction or another, but they're not. So why is it that such a straightforward process of looking at the ratio of these two things gives us answers that are not only wildly inaccurate, but completely inconsistent with each other? You might have seen this example before if you haven't seen another creation presentation on radiometric dating. But imagine you have this tap here, and it's dripping. You come across it, and you're a sciencey type person. You've got some measurement things in your possession, and you're able to measure that this tap is dripping at a rate of about 50 milliliters per hour. So you can see it is 300 milliliters full. So how long has it been dripping? 6 hours? Good question. You know where this is going. It hasn't been dripping for 6 hours. Your math is right. What could cause it to not have been dripping for 6 hours? Yeah.
Well, you don't know what happened before you got there. So it could have been running before you got there.
Exactly.
You dumped it before you got there.
You have no idea what it was like before you came on the scene. You don't know if this started out empty or if it started out right here at 200. You have no idea, if even if it did start out empty, if a dog from the previous example came across it and started drinking out of it because he was thirsty. You have no idea all the number of assumptions that we're making here. You have no idea that it's been dripping at 50 milliliters per hour for 6 hours. Yeah, it's dripping that way now. You have no idea it's been that way the whole time. And we can kind of talk about this in terms of all the assumptions that you have to make here. So when we talk about these radioactive elements turning into non-radioactive elements, we call the radioactive element the parent and the non-radioactive element the daughter. You can sort of think of it like an hourglass. So we have to assume that we started with all radioactive element when we're doing this process. We have to assume we started with no non-radioactive element. We have to assume the decay rate has been the same the whole time. You have to assume no radioactive element has been added to the system. You have to assume it hasn't been subtracted from a system. You have to assume no non-radioactive element has been added to the system or subtracted from the system. That's 7 assumptions that we can't verify. And so the fact that we're getting inaccurate and inconsistent results from examples that we know the age of mean at least one of these 7 assumptions must be wrong, but probably several. Meanwhile, who here knows about carbon dating? Got to talk about carbon dating if we're going to talk about radiometric dating. Carbon dating is a wonderful friend to the biblical version of history here because carbon dating decays extremely quickly compared with the decay rates of the things that we use to supposedly get the age of the Earth being billions of years old. It decays very fast. It decays so fast, actually, that if it's been, there's no way radioactive carbon can still be in anything that's older than 90,000 years old. So if you find radioactive carbon in something, I'm not saying it's 90,000 years old, but that's the ceiling. There's no way it can be any older than that. So when we look at things like coal, guess what we find inside coal seams all across the world that are supposedly hundreds of millions of years old? We find radioactive carbon. Guess what we find inside diamonds that are supposedly billions of years old? We find radioactive carbon. But it can't be there if they're really that age. Guess what we find inside dinosaur bones? We find radioactive carbon, but it can't still be there if it's really that old. Our radiometric dating machines are very sophisticated, and they can detect a very small amount of radioactive carbon, but there's a point at which it just can't see it anymore. And all these things should have been well past that point. But there it is, staring at us straight in the face. These things can't be any older than 90,000 years. And of course, I'm not saying they're 90,000 years old. I think they are no more than 6,000 years old, because that's how old I believe the Earth is. But it's interesting that when we look at this stuff, once again, God's world complements His Word. And God's Word complements His world. And we should expect no else. All right, let's finish this off by talking about life and death, because, if you believe one thing, if you believe that this world was made from a chaotic Big Bang explosion and through this process of evolution, you're going to have a certain view of life, death, ethics, morality, and all that goes along with it. But if you believe in what the Bible says, you're going to have an entirely different viewpoint on that. So I want to explore this a little bit here. So Genesis 1 verse 31 says, "And God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. There was evening, there was morning, the sixth day." If you go by what so many churches teach today, though, they teach that God used death and suffering through evolution to bring humanity and everything into being. That's what a large majority of Christian churches inside the United States teach. And I think that's very, very sad for a lot of different reasons. So, Paul tells us this: "Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all men because all sinned." And so this is basically a summary of everything that's happened on earth since the beginning, every important thing that's happened. Mankind was created by God, mankind sinned, and that brought death and suffering into the world. So what Jesus did, he had to come into the world and fix all that. He died a perfect death, having never sinned, thereby reconciling mankind with God. But folks, if you take this arrow away, and death and suffering and disease and decay, if that was all here before mankind arrived on the scene, then we're not responsible for it being here. So then, why did Jesus have to die? Doesn't make much sense anymore then, does it? The whole reason Jesus had to come into this world and become fully human is because humanity was responsible for sin and death being here in the first place. Folks, you remove that arrow and you say that God used evolution to get us all here, you completely undermine the entire gospel message. Furthermore, you'd have to say that God would say that death is normal, even good, because if he used evolution to get us here, well, then if he used death and suffering to make that good thing happen, by definition, it would have to be good too. But of course, that's not the God I worship, and that's not the God you worship. So this is the story of Lazarus here. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. You can see here, I actually have deeply moved in bold right there. And when you look in the original languages, what that means is that Jesus was angry with the death that overcame his friend. So folks, when we look at death, Jesus was mad at it. There's no way our God would have used death and suffering and disease to get this whole thing started and bring us here. Take away the stone. Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you have sent me." When he said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out. Death is an intrusion into God's perfect world. He didn't design it that way. This cursed world that we live in, which is our fault, was not God's original design. It wasn't supposed to be this way, folks. But that's not the end of the story. So in Revelation, John gives us a little bit of a preview, what we all have to look forward to, on account of what Jesus did for us. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and he will be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." This is a cursed world. There's a lot wrong with it. But we are very blessed to be here. How blessed we are that God has seen fit to use us as tools to further his kingdom. But in the end, and you know this, we're just visiting. Because when you close your eyes for the last time in this world, and you open them for the first time in the next, you're going to see your Savior face to face, and he's going to come running up to you, and he's going to give you a great big hug, and he's going to say, "Welcome home." If you would pray with me, please. Dear God, thank you for bringing us safely here tonight. Lord God, we stand in awe of your magnificent creation. Heavenly Father, as we go forward today, give us a greater appreciation for who you are, what you've done, and give us the strength to share that with those that we impact in our lives. We join today in the prayer that your Son taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate it.